second public lecture that she gives. So today's lecture is on this title, the potential of science diplomacy for the 21st century. So let me just read out briefly Helga's bio. So for those of you who might not be familiar with Helga. So Helga Nowotny is Professor Emerita of Science and Technology Studies at ETH Zurich and a founding member of the European Research Council. In 2007, she was elected ERC, European Research Council Vice President, and from March 2010 until December 2013, she was the President of the ERC. Currently, she is Chair of the ERA Council Forum Austria, member of the Austrian Council, and Vice President of the Council for the Lindau Nobel Laureate Meetings. She is also visiting professor at NTU Singapore, and among others, Helga is a foreign member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and continues to serve on many international advisory boards in Austria and throughout Europe. She has published widely in Science and Technology Study, SDS, and on Social Time. Okay. Helga has published more than 300 articles in scientific journals. Her latest book in German is Eigenschaft Revisited, Inside the Algorithm. Her previous book includes The Cunning of Uncertainty that was featured by the Financial Times on the list of the best book 2015. Naked Genes, Reinventing the Human in the Molecular Age, and many others. Okay? It's a privilege to have Helga here, so it's time for Helga to deliver the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And you may wonder why the topic. And the answer is a very straightforward one. We face enormous global challenges that cannot be tackled by any one country alone. This starts with climate change that keeps us very much occupied and preoccupied. It includes, of course, epidemics of various kinds and all the other food shortages, water shortages, how to manage the energy transition, and so on. So we have a host of global problems. And not only in my view, but also in that of others, nation states are not well prepared for collective action that will be required to tackle these challenges. And this is where science diplomacy enters, because diplomacy, as you know, deals about the relations between states. It goes back very, very long. Already in antiquity, you had emissaries, the proto-diplomats, visiting other empires and courts, etc. And by now, diplomacy is the way that has become established in how to deal with it. But where does science enter into diplomacy in order to tackle these challenges? So this is why I think the topic is important. And as it says here in the under title, an STS perspective. STS stands for Science and Technology Studies. And those of you who have not heard much about science and technology studies, let me just give you a very, very brief view of what it is all about. There have always been philosophers who have wondered, what are scientists doing? And so you have a long string of philosophical texts. Mostly they were interested in physics because physics was regarded at the forefront of scientific developments. And so you had philosophy of science. Later on, sociologists joined and said, well, science has become so important in our time. Let's study how scientific institutions function, who among the students chooses what discipline, what happens to them later on, etc. So you have a lot of empirical studies. But the content of what scientists do was not thought to be amenable to be studied by people not from the same disciplines. So only physicists could study what physicists do, but no one else. Only mathematicians could study what mathematicians do. And then a bunch of young people came along in the 70s. They were anthropologists, they were sociologists. They also came with some of them came with a scientific background, and they said, let's go into a lab. Like, here in NTU, you have all these labs surrounding you, but how many of you have actually gone and visited another lab that does not belong to your discipline? I think there are very few among you. And so these people said, let's go and let's see what are they doing. So they went to one lab in California, the Salk lab, and their first surprise was what they heard people talking about. And they knew philosophers had always been obsessed by what is scientific truth, a big problem that continues, of course, to interest philosophers. But in the lab, no one was speaking about truth. They wanted to know, does it work or not? If we set up an experiment, have we done it in the right way so that we can interpret the results? They were eager to rewrite their findings. So these anthropologists, sociologists, the earliest bunch of people who were doing STS were doing anthropological work, like studying a tribe. They were studying these scientists, and this is how it started. And since then, it has become not a vast field, but it has become quite an established field, interested from a social science point of view to see what do scientists do, what is their motivation, what is their behavior, how do they relate to the substance they are working with, the topics they are studying, but also what is the larger context. There are funding agencies. What do they fund? What are the priorities? How do priorities come about? They don't fall from heaven. So what is going on? And above all, how is science changing the world, but also can we include the public? How are we communicating with the public? Science needs public support, but at the same time, we know the public does not just accept everything that scientists do. There are controversies that have come up, for instance, in Europe when nuclear energy was promoted to be the energy source of the future. There were social protest movements that questioned the safety, that questioned whether it was really going to be the energy. Then you had controversies about genetically modified organisms, and so on and so on. So all this is part of what STS people are interested in. And today I want to share with you, from an STS perspective, why I think we should become interested in looking at science diplomacy as one way of tackling what the 21st century holds in store in terms of global challenges. So as always, it's good to go back and put things into a somewhat larger context. I'm speaking here to people who come from different disciplines, so I always try to give you a broader view because I think this is the way I can relate better to you, but also you to me, and hopefully also amongst you. So science is still largely nationally organized. We have a lot of international corporations going on, but if you look at the career system, promotion system, the whole way up from deciding I want to enroll in a university, I want to study this, until you become a professor or you go elsewhere for your professional career, it's still largely within a national frame. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what has been the relationship between science and the state? And how has it changed over time? Obviously, enormously. And if we go back to what we call modern science, or the scientific revolution, very much connected with people like Galileo Galilei. When we speak about the scientific revolution, it's a somewhat misleading term. It was not a revolution in terms of bringing people out to protest. It was rather a very potent social movement. It was a small group of people who called themselves natural philosophers. At those days, the term scientist did not yet exist. It only came up around 1830. So these natural philosophers, natural because they wanted to study nature, banded together to exchange the experiments that they began to set up. They began to visit each other. Much of what makes up scientific and research life today was already there at the very beginning. But it was a social movement in the sense that you had in many countries in Europe, it started in Europe, many countries in Europe, you had what you would call the middle class. You had teachers, you had early pharmacists, you had notaries who said, well, something is going on here, something that is exciting, that will also help us to better people's life, because this was one of the triggers and the impetus behind modern science, very much connected with a name like Francis Bacon, who was arguing, we do science because these insights into how nature works will help us to put it to practical use, to improve people's life. But in order to understand, you have to do experiments, you have to do what we call today basic science or fundamental science. So both of these were already there from the very beginning. Now, the relationship to the state, you remember the trial of Galileo. It was the Vatican, the church authorities of the Catholic Church that did not like his teaching because it was contradicting Catholic dogma. And the church was afraid if this spreads out, it will undermine our authority. And likewise, the monarchs were suspicious of scientists because they kept speaking and corresponding about things that no one else understood. So what was going on there? The Royal Society was set up in London, but similar institutions existed in France, in St. Petersburg, in Russia, and other places, for these early scientists to come together and to stage experiments. Here on the right side, you can see, which was very typical for this early modern science, they were staging experiments in public. Why? They were not thinking of public support as much. They were thinking, we need people who can testify what we are doing. The other day I mentioned there was this inbred suspicion, can we trust what we see? An experiment is set up, can we trust the results? Because everything hinged on the results being replicable, being valid. And in order for it to be valid, they needed people to witness what they were doing. And so the witnesses, they came from the general public, but they had to be gentlemen. Now, what does gentleman mean? It means not to be a woman, first of all, but above all, it meant you had to have sufficient economic means to be independent. So if you were employed by someone else, someone paid you, you were not considered to be independent enough in your judgment. So it was an interesting notion, the kind of witnesses, credible witnesses that were needed for this. And so they were seen by suspicion. It was not an easy way to get started because the church, and they were caught between the church on the one hand, religious authorities, and of course the political authorities on the other hand. And so the Royal Society in London, for instance, came up with the idea, and they managed with the Crown to get a kind of set of privileges. What were we allowed to do that was not seen as interfering with the political authorities? And in these privileges, they were allowed, for instance, to dissect corpses. This was the only way how people in those times could get any idea of what was inside the body. Today, we have brain scans, we have all kinds of invasive and non-invasive ways of finding out blood markers, tests of various kinds. None of these existed in those days. So this is one of the privileges they obtained. Another privilege was to escape censorship. So they could write letters to their colleagues in St. Petersburg or in Paris that were not under public and political censorship and so on. But as it was a contract, what is it they had to give on their side? And they had to promise not to meddle in politics. So this distance to politics was there from the very beginning. Not to meddle in theology, no way distance to religion. Not to meddle in rhetorics, which was one of the disciplines that were taught in universities in those days. So stay away from that. Stay in your lab, do your experiments, tell us how to do things better, but stay there. And this is something that science has inherited from these very first moments. Then we move on, and the age of discovery, the person you see sitting here is Alexander von Humboldt. He was a world traveler in the beginning of the 18th century. He traveled to Latin America, but he also was in America. He was against slavery. He visited Jefferson, etc. So there were people like him. But the reason why I think he stands out from many other travelers, because he was one of the first one to understand how in nature, everything is connected. And today, when we speak about ecology, he was really one of the forefathers of what we call environmentalism and ecology in terms of looking holistically. But they all had to bring back specimens, objects of various kinds. So there started a huge collection of objects, but also of measurements. Alexander von Humboldt, for instance, he went up with his companion to the highest mountain in Latin America to do measurements. And he discovered where the tree line starts, where the tree line ends. And so all these, was collected and brought back home. And back home meant he had inherited considerable fortune from his family, but others of these explorers and collectors needed patrons. So you had to bring back the collections. Darwin brought back huge collections that he later exploited for his world. So collecting from all over the world was part of it. But then slowly, these objects became what we today call data. And I will come back to data to make this big jump between these early times and the 21st century. And then, of course, came industrialization. And for the first time, technology became much more connected with science. Technology has always existed everywhere. People made tools, people started to work on them, use them to make their life easier, to get resources from the environment. But it had nothing or very little to do with science. And it was only in the 19th century when science and technology came closer together, because you needed technology to do your research, and your research, the scientific findings, were feeding back into technology. And this is really the basis. This is what is driving, we call it the technosciences, today with research, new research instrumentation, which you cannot buy from a firm. You have to invent it in the lab yourself. But later you invite the firm, and the firm sets it up and sells it to other labs. So we have created quite a bit of industry around the technosciences that keep this going. Then let's move on in history. There came, we are already now, just before the First World War, where everything came to a brutal halt, there came an enormous wave of internationalization. And the industrialized powers of the day were competing against each other in terms of their industrial prowess. Who was producing more, who was having greater access to world markets to sell your products, etc. And all this was put up in these world exhibitions. We still have world exhibitions today, but they have none of the impact that the world exhibitions, the early ones, had in their day. Because people were talking about it, you saw the latest products, you went there to be inspired, etc. But underneath it was the competition between the world powers of the day. And competition there was, but there was also cooperation. And don't mind if you cannot read this, I just find it amazing, the list of international organizations that were set up, and this is just a short list. And, just taking out randomly, you have an International Federation of Motorcyclists, which was founded in 1904 in Switzerland. You have an International Alliance of Women, 1902. You have an International Council on Alcohol and Addiction, 1907. I mean, I can go on, and there is more here. And so this is a testimony to the kind of cooperation that went on underneath, this industrial competition. People wanted to link up with others who were preoccupied by social issues or who wanted to share their, enthusiasm about new sports, about new products, or whatever have you. And then all this came to a brutal halt with the First World War. And you see it in the number of international corporations, you see it in the number of publications, co-authorship, everything went down. So this is, of course, a big topic, the role of scientists in war. Scientists have always been affiliated also and had to be drawn into, with their knowledge about technology and into science, into the military production line. But it goes already back. We find it in ancient Greece. We find it when we look at Leonardo's drawings, how to help the Florentines versus the Pisans, etc., etc. So this is a very big topic. But what happened here with the First World War is the first time, unfortunately, it was also industrialized warfare on a very broad scale. And the person you see here is Fritz Haber, and he was the inventor of a famous procedure, how to synthesize how to synthesize ammoniac, and this invention led to this kind of dual use, as we call it today. On the one hand, it was enormously important as a fertilizer in agriculture, and at the same time, the same ideas were used to produce chlorine gas that was used for the first time in in the First World War, as you see here. And scientists were caught here taking sides. This is an infamous manifesto undersigned by 3,000 German professors who disputed in the manifesto the use of chlorine gas that was used already when the Germans invaded Belgium in 1915. And then there was a counter manifesto that was signed, among others, by Einstein, by very few people. So, you know, these are the kind of documents that show how scientists were captured in a nationalistic fervor and very few standing up against it. And this is also, unfortunately, part of our history and the role of science and scientists to the nation state. Now, the turning point came, and it's indeed a historical turning point, with the atomic bomb and everything that happened after 45. Now, after 45, you would no longer find these kind of manifestos, we are supporting only our nation state, but instead you had the other narrative of science. And the narrative of science says science is universal. It does not regard where you come from. It is not interested in gender, in your ethnicity. We are universal, and we are international, and we are politically neutral. So this idea of political neutrality was taken up again. And as a kind of motto you can read here, it summarizes this narrative very well, what Louis Pasteur said already at his time: science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity. And this has become sort of the creed of science today. And here at NTU, you have now an Institute, Science Technology for Humanity, which is very much in this spirit. Science, technology belong to humanity. And not enough of just having a narrative, this shock after what had happened in the Second World War, was captured by this slogan, never again. We have to build up a world where this can never happen again. And this is why you have a number of international organizations that were set up, the United Nations foremost, UNESCO, the S stands for science. People often don't remember this. UNESCO is the UN Science and Cultural Organization. You have the Linda laureate meetings, with which, as Oku said, I'm still associated, or I am associated. They started in 1951, and the idea was, can we bring scientists together to discuss with young scientists what needs to be done in order not to involve science and not let this happen again. You had organizations like CERN, the particle accelerators, set up already in 1954 as an international organization, and the Pugwash conferences, the atomic scientists, trying to prevent nuclear weapons to get out of control, etc., etc. And then came the Cold War. And the Cold War is interesting because you had an ongoing US and Soviet, two superpowers during the Cold War, and nevertheless you had cooperation going on between scientists. Mostly they were physicists and engineers, because this is what the armament and possibly disarmament was all about. And Kip Thorne, he got the Nobel Prize in 1917, so just 2 years ago, for his work with others on showing the waves, the detection of waves that came from the collision of two black holes 1,300,000,000 years back. And he, in his Nobel laureate speech, mentioned his collaboration with his Soviet colleague. And he said, he was my mentor. I discussed my experiments, my theoretical work with him in the time during the Cold War where you thought everything was frozen, and nevertheless. So this was a kind of science diplomacy, if you want, before the name, this kind of very intense personal cooperation. But there was a result, and many people are convinced that the treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater would not have come about. It was signed and came into effect in 1963 without this ongoing cooperation on both sides. So you can say, it started on a personal level, because each side had to convince their governments there's something useful to get out of this, but nevertheless, it had a very tangible result. And since then, we have seen a number of other international treaties, Antarctic Treaty, Outer Space Treaty, Law of the Sea, Arctic Council, more to come, etc. But what is interesting is, if you look at the Outer Space Treaty 67, there is no mention of what preoccupies people today, namely who owns. Not outer space cannot be owned, but who can have ownership if we start to mine asteroids. These blocks of minerals covered by ice, etc., that fly around in space. They contain minerals that are of interest to us here. So who controls something like asteroid mining? And there are other resources in outer space that are of interest to us now. But in 1967, no one thought of it when the treaty was written. So now this has become an issue. And there's a tiny little country in Europe by the name of Luxembourg, and it's really tiny. And they had the idea, we set up Luxembourg as a host for companies that want to use the resources for outer space mining, and they provided a framework for how to do it and so on. So you have these ongoing negotiations, you have the attempts, how can we not just preserve, the Arctic Council, of course, how to preserve the pristine spaces that we still have here, but how can we also use it for economic advantages. And this brings us to the kind of global challenges in the 21st century, because it is clear our habitat is limited. Some people dream and have plans to, inhabit and colonize outer space, but this will take a long time, and there certainly will not be enough space for the 10 billions of people we will have on the Earth by then, if we succeed in ruining our environment completely. So for the 21st century, it has become obvious that what is needed in the kind of efforts that have to be undertaken has to do with data. Data. We have to monitor what goes on. And already since the 70s, you had some global international infrastructures that were set up to monitor what went on in the atmosphere, to monitor what went on in the oceans. You had all kinds of monitoring. Of course, in the health field, the World Health Organization had it from the very beginning as its mandate to have data on pandemics, on epidemics, on the state of health all over the world, etc. And data became the shareable asset that is important if we want to be able to tackle what is ahead of us. This is behind the renewed interest in science diplomacy. Here you see the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And the renewed interest can be traced back to the global context and seeing and understanding that we need to act together if we want to get anywhere. Secondly, that these international efforts, whether it starts with monitoring or whether it moves on to what we do, the kind of intervention strategies that will be needed, we need science and technology in order to make any progress. And then also, last but not least, we see a decline in what is called the hard power, moving into another country by military force, etc., receding and the place being taken by what is called soft power. And science diplomacy is one way of soft power. Now, having said this, science diplomacy also, took shape slowly. It's also interesting that it was only in the year 2000 that the US State Department considered it necessary and useful to have a scientific and technological advisor. And even the current president has kept this advisor to the State Department. Now, the State Department employs roughly 60,000 people, and I'm not speaking about the problems that diplomats have these days with various other issues, but the State Department, decided we also need graduates with a PhD in science and engineering. And now there are about 300 PhDs working in the State Department alone in order to advise and help when the State Department needs action that has a science and technology component. And in many other countries, you have some kind of scientific and technological advisors as well. The AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also became active, and there were two influential reports that were published in 2010 together with the Royal Society about science diplomacy. The AAAS set up a center for science diplomacy that is still running, and also there is a publication, a quarterly magazine that some of you may know. Now, here are some definitions that are taken from the report. How did they conceive this? So they say, where's the place? What does it mean, science and diplomacy, science diplomacy? So they say you can distinguish science in diplomacy. So you inform foreign policy whenever you need scientific advice. You have diplomacy for science, so we should also be able to use diplomats if we want to have an agreement with people, scientists in other countries. And science for diplomacy, you want to use it as a way of helping countries to use soft power and to avoid wars. Now, science diplomacy obviously is not a magic bullet. The kind of problems it can solve, even if the aspiration is here, promote understanding, promote prosperity for all. This is fine on a rhetorical level, but underneath there's still a number of problems. And this was a meeting by the Bosch Foundation in Germany. And in this meeting, they came up with a number of recommendations. Amongst them, they said, well, apply the scientific method to science diplomacy itself. You're dealing with science. So scientific diplomacy can also be subject to the scientific method. And they also said, there is always a link. Science diplomacy is never completely neutral. The diplomats are in the service of the state has national interests. So science diplomacy is also part of these interests. Now you negotiate, if everyone has interests, you try to negotiate, you try to come to agreements. But one of the recommendations says, if these goals are economic, make it transparent. Say it from the beginning and don't try, to hide it behind nice-sounding words like, prosperity for all, if what you are interested in is to promote your own markets. So, and what we see really is, and I come back to this in a second. What we see is also that science diplomacy, is still caught in this web of national interests. And one of the recommendations is be transparent, be forthright, be explicit about them. Now, so far, the things that I've mentioned belong to what I would say the formal side of science diplomacy. But then there's an informal side, like the cooperation between Torp and his Russian colleague. But also you, here at NTU in Singapore, everywhere, you have, I don't know how many memorandums of understanding. Whenever ministers or deans or presidents travel elsewhere, they like to come back with a piece of paper that is called a memorandum of understanding. And so you have, and some of them will nothing will happen, but others may turn into fruitful scientific cooperations. So you have this informal layer of links that you have. And if you look at any one of these maps that you find by now, publications, look in any field, you can see how many multiple authors in many different parts of the world work together now. You can see an increase in this international cooperation reflected in multi-authored publication. But you also have NGOs, you have international organizations. Academics at Risk or Researchers at Risk is an NGO, an international NGO that tries to step in when in some countries researchers, as happened now, again in Iran, these were environmental researchers active in conservation. They were captured as spies and they were condemned to a long prison term. And so, they try to step in here. And this is part of an informal science diplomacy. Then you have also these science and technology agreements, and people have wondered, are they strategic, are they ad hoc? Of course, they are both. It always depends when it is used. I still recall one little anecdote. I was visiting the International Institute of Science in Bangalore, and there was a French visitor whom I met over breakfast, and so we started to speak what he's doing here. He says, well, we have wonderful cooperation going on with the people here in Bangalore since years, but we should never go through Delhi. We should never involve the bureaucracy in Delhi because this would be the end of our cooperation. And so, this is the kind of informal kind of cooperation that works best if researchers get together because they have a shared interest. And this is part of the informal science diplomacy. Now, these are some of the ongoing efforts that have been put into practice, highly symbolic, the SESAM facility infrastructure, which is synchrotron infrastructure that brings together a number of countries in the Middle East that you would never expect to be able to work together, amongst them Iran and Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Bahrain, the Palestinian authorities are there on paper, etc., etc. So you have symbolic, but at the same time, the people working there, they take back something. So again, it's a long process. It happens under the official radar, and you never know what good might come out of it. Then there is the space going on, and the latest is the square kilometer array built in Australia and in South Africa. Now, let me turn to what I think is the most interesting part. I've given you a lot of historical background, but I think it's always important to know where do we come from in order to know where are we now and where do we want or should we go in the future. And this is the advent of big data and large infrastructures. And so from an STS perspective, again, on the one thing is to say, okay, we have entered the era of big data. We know big infrastructures are the way to do it if you want to act on a global level. But, there are also the tensions that are involved in it. And the tensions have to do with data. Are they a public good or are they a private commodity? Who owns these kind of data? Algorithms that are used, are they transparent? Is accountability one of the principles? Recently, a group of researchers at ETH Zurich have looked at all available public and private by corporations declarations about ethical artificial intelligence. Everyone says our artificial intelligence has to follow ethical principles, etc. So they looked at it, and there are about 100 roughly. Half of them come from the private sector, big corporations, smaller corporations, and the rest comes from governments. And they were interested to find out, what are the principles? We are speaking about, global data, global exchange. AI should be ethical, not just in some places, but in all places, because they will be all over the place. And surprisingly, they found little to no agreement even about the principles. And the only concept that came up around 50% of all the documents was the concept of transparency. But there was no digging deeper. You could not even say, transparency means that a definition that we can agree upon. So there is huge work to be done in the future. If we want to get a common agreement of what are the kind of ethical principles that we want to follow in our work with data, with algorithms, against the biases that we have, etc. And even if these well-intentioned public declarations, these are the principles we will follow. If you put them together, there is no agreement. Where are we in a globalized world in the 21st century? So you saw the definitions of science diplomacy going back to these reports. From an STS perspective, you always want to see what are people doing. You want to look at the practices. And so to follow the practices, and the practices are situated at the interface between national interests. National interests are still there, corporate interests are still there everywhere, but recognize them. And it's the interface between the science that wants to move on, that has research questions that scientists and researchers find interesting to follow, and the national interest. So what is happening there? And you have multiple stakeholders and what kind of negotiations are going on. So big data, they are here to stay with us. How did they get so big? Well, remember Alexander von Humboldt and other explorers bringing back the objects and specimen, the very first form of data that we had. And now data have become a big asset, and it's an asset because it can be purposed and repurposed. And you can use data to answer questions that were not even asked and nobody thought of them when they were collected. So this is what makes data such a precious asset. And of course, states were always interested in collecting statistics. They had to be standardized. You needed food security. You needed to regulate markets, etc. So data is not as new. That's what I want to underline here. And then, of course, you had mechanization. And now we have these huge infrastructures. And this is, the development within a very short time that you can see in terms of processing. But there are also many more areas that are being covered. Of course, having immediate data after the outbreak of an epidemic, Ebola, you need the information, you need the data immediately. Tsunamis, again, I remember in India, there was a major tsunami in 1970. And India has owns a few islands in the Indian Ocean called the Andaman Islands. Anthropologists may know it because this was a famous place for anthropologists to study the natives there. But in the Andaman Islands, there is a military outpost there, and they had a fax machine. And the fax machine had a number in daily, so they knew what was happening, and they should warn the people in daily. And they had the wrong fax number because it had been changed. And so, the warning never got to the capital in 1997. And this means, the state of preparedness or unpreparedness for such catastrophes to happen. Now, by now, more and more countries have signed up to how can we have warning systems, special buoys that measure the height of the waves, etc., etc. All this is part of the kind of use of data that we need in order to cope. And the weather prediction has become really very, very impressive. We are able to follow the tracking of a storm, the tracking of a hurricane. But, the people in charge, this is still in the public domain. Our weather data are internationally shared. But then there are some countries that want to remove themselves because they say it's becoming too expensive. And once you have private companies moving in, you don't know what is going to happen. So what is at stake here is also our definition of what is a public good and which data should and must remain in the public domain. The latest news here is that the 5G broadband in one higher region in the atmosphere will get very close to measurements that are taken here in the same region. And if that happens, the weather dates will no longer be reliable. So we find ourselves really in this struggle about public good that touches not just what happens within one country, but it has repercussions to everywhere in the world. So let me come to the end here, and let's move to how does this affect how science and research are organized. And there are continuous changes in the organization of science, of course. What is a research institute? What is a university? You know, it keeps changing over time. And we want to know what are the trends, where are we following? So what is happening here also in science diplomacy is sort of this tension between what I would like to call normative power and market power. Especially China has become a geo-economic actor at a very large stage, using geoeconomics as a way of doing diplomacy in their own way. And the European Union, not having much in terms of market power, is emphasizing the normative component. We want to set up something that is, sorry, I have to, let's get some water. And that is close to values. And the European Research Council, and you mentioned my former affiliation with it, I still follow what happened, and so there's now an agreement with Singapore, so this is also part of science diplomacy. But these are the kind of issues without having clear-cut answers that are part of where we are now, what we are facing. And they have an impact on the way how science is organized. Who owns which kind of data? How can we reconcile different interests, different aspects? Where does privacy come in? It's different in the medical field, it's different in other fields. So all these are considerations to be taken into account. You have, as I mentioned before, this issue, can we maintain science as a public good? And also how to involve citizens. Now, what is interesting from my point of view is also that the norms of science are changing. Now, what are the norms of science? There are integrity statements. There is something called the ethos of science, and this is also changing. There is no document where you can read, every researcher in the world signs up to it. But there is an implicit understanding amongst most researchers what this ethos is all about. And in 1942, Robert Merton, who was one of the first sociologists of science, he wrote a book called The Normative Structure of Science. 1942 was in the middle of the Second World War, and his question was, if you compare science in the free world to science under totalitarian regimes, namely Russia and Nazi Germany, what difference is there? That was his question. Can science thrive under totalitarian regimes, or can it thrive only under democratic regimes? Now, we know there's an efficiency in totalitarian regimes just as well, no way of denying it. But of course, there are also differences. And his argument was why science, flourishes and thrives in a free world better than in a totalitarian regime was because the ethos of scientists is different. In a totalitarian regime, you do what you are told or you know. If you want to have the possibility to continue working in your scientific area, you better, follow what the regime tells you to do. And so he, in this ethos, he came up with 4 points that today to us seem, well, way, way back. The first one, he called it communism. No one understands why he called it communism, but what he meant was, researchers want to share their findings. It's a common good and common ownership. So communism in this idealistic sense, there is no private property involved. And so he thought we should not have private property on our findings. A scientist should, not own anything. Now, we know how this has changed. And also Einstein, by the way, he was against private property, IPs, on scientific findings because he thought, it hems in curiosity. If you know that some people work on an area where you have a lot of patents, you will not get very far. So, they turn to something else. So these are ongoing arguments. Anyway, we have changed and our attitude, and now patents are in every ranking list, performance agreements, etc. of universities. You count the patents, and of course everyone is proud if you are able to set up a firm, and the university leadership encourages you. And also the big change in the US came about with the amendment to the Bayh-Dole Act, 1980, when the right to have patents was granted to firms, but also to universities, which made the big impact. If the research was federally funded, they could have patents on it and not, the federal government. And this made a huge difference. And, the IP rates shot up in American universities. And then this was imitated by everyone around the world. So we have changed this completely. But the ethos of science, I would claim, is still there. Because, do you have patents on what? Okay, there are all the familiar stuff that you want to have patents. But once you come to genetics and, the subtle questions, who owns a living cell? You cannot own and patent a living cell, even if you have worked on it. So you get into all these subtleties. And in the future, we will get more and more of these findings. And researchers, even if officially, there's no agreement, no statement on it, nevertheless, there's an underlying ethos in the sense of asking ourselves, what should be done? And researchers are the ones who are in the front line. And the lawyers and the parliaments come much later. The law is always lagging behind. But researchers are the ones who know, and even if they cannot foresee everything that will be done with their findings, nevertheless, they have a better feeling of both the benefits and the risk. So this is one of the ethos points of Robert Merton. The other one was universalism. So this we still believe. Even if we have discovered belief is not enough. If you say, science is gender-free, we know from many studies that it is more difficult for women to publish, to get promotion. MIT, a couple of years ago, made a study how many square feet were occupied by women and by men in the MIT laboratories. And lo and behold, women had less space than their male colleagues. So the ethos needs to be filled up as well in order to be able to say, yes, we uphold universalism. Then for Bob Merton, it was what he called intrinsic rewards. He called it disinterestedness. So again, be interested in your own research, to be driven by your own rewards and not just rely on what comes from the outside. And today, when any system gets too much driven by outer-directed indicators, key performance indicators, and the like, your intrinsic reward system is going to suffer. And I would say there comes a point when it also produces less interesting and less good science. So there is something there in this ethos and how it is being interpreted that is still, makes us think today. And the last one is organized skepticism. Skepticism is needed. It's organized in science by peer review, etc., even if you know it has many flaws. But above all, it means you have to test, you have to question, you have to test again in order to get valid results. Now, this is the ethos and some of the changes. But then there are other norms that are changing today. And one of these changes come from the fact that the organization of science changes towards larger infrastructures that I've mentioned repeatedly now, larger teams that work together, and we are moving strongly in that direction of much more teamwork. And this raises question, where's the space for the individual? We know the individual still matters, and believe me, the individual will also matter in the future. But how do we, who gets what credit as an author on publications? An issue that keeps on being debated. Not everyone has the solution that CERN has. You list 400 or 500 authors in alphabetical order that contributed to the experiment at CERN. And we can see changes that try to be more just, that try to do justice to the changes that occur on the ground. And so we want to keep encouraging the individual. At the same time, we have to take into account that science is moving in the direction of larger teams. Another one is frugal versus expensive science. Maybe in Singapore you don't have the problem of frugal science, but in many countries of the world, especially in the global south, this is a burning issue. We just cannot afford it. But can we still do some good research that addresses the needs of the population? And we call it frugal science. And again, what can be done? It's not cheap science. It's frugal science. You have to think very carefully, what kind of experiments can I do with the little means? And some people come up with very imaginative ideas. And also historians of science have pointed out to, cases. Once you work under constraints, sometimes creativity gets a boost. And then you can utilize it more fully. And then we have an interesting discussion going on that also follows the changes in contemporary organization of science, namely how centralized and localized should it be, and how much distributed can it be. The infrastructures I showed you were centralized, even if they have relations to others. But by now, we can set up a research organization in different places, linking them. But it poses a number of questions for the governance of such an organization. And Finally, last but not least, how to involve citizens. This has become more and more obvious. Science is not something that works in a vacuum. Open science has become a growing movement, and open science means also not just to get away from publishers who ask a lot of money, although the research has already been funded, etc. But it also means open towards the needs of citizens, how to involve them in citizen science projects, etc. So my final question, what can we learn through the lens of science diplomacy? The first point, going back in history, we have arrived at how do we tackle the challenges ahead of us. And in Europe, I can see a strong alignment, which comes from the way how we organize the European research frameworks. There's a lot of emphasis on the kind of global challenges. Sustainable development goals, etc., how to align what universities do, etc., and this is taken up very, very quickly. The Sustainable Development Goals, and we will see much more of it involving people on the ground who have knowledge to contribute, how to secure water, how to secure food, demographics, etc., etc. Then the question of sharing, the question of ownership, and the changing norms of science. So I hope I have given you a flavor of some of the ongoing changes in the organization of science, but also what it means for us who are working in different parts in the scientific enterprise, be it in universities, be it in research institutions, be it in teaching and in schools. Science and technology are so much impacting on the way we live today, the way how we organize our lives, that it's a question I feel is touching everyone. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions.
Perhaps I can start.
Yes.
When we introduce this concept of science diplomacy, I think in some way it changes the narrative or the frame that we talk about in the post-World War II on science as universal and science knows country, knowledge belongs to humanity. So I'm not sure whether it's helpful in that sense because we introduce the element of competition. When we talk about science diplomacy, of course we know they say there are three different elements: there's science and diplomacy, and diplomacy for science. But I'm just wondering whether it's a helpful concept for when that changes, as you say, the narrative about what science is.
Well, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but let me try to answer the following way. Science, I consider science diplomacy a useful way to see how we can promote and help, this ideal of science belongs to humanity. It's an ideal, as we know, because the national interests are there, and whether it's asteroid mining or whether it's data sharing, we are up again and again with national boundaries, with national interests. Nevertheless, and this is, if you want, part of the ethos of science. Science should be a public good. Science should be there for humanity to share. It's in contradiction with what happens, but this is what always is the case if you have an ideal and if you look what happens on the ground. And when you speak to scientists, they very much feel we all live with contradictions. We have different ideas, we have different goals, and no one of us is without contradictions. But nevertheless, it helps if you are aware there is this contradiction. And to strive to start to conceive of, we have only this one planet on which we live. We have these problems of sea level rise, of climate change, etc. So unless we start sharing more, we will get stuck in where we are. So I hope this answers your question.
Yes, question.
Hi, I'm Jared Goddard from the Wiki School of Communication and Information. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. It was terrific. Well, I had a question, I suppose, about the science, diplomacy, and the big data infrastructure part of the talk, which I thought was very intriguing indeed and very important. Are there some lessons to be learned from the histories of e-research infrastructures over the last 10 or 20 years for the current dilemmas around data and infrastructures? Well, I'm kind of interested because I have a bit of involvement in the e-research infrastructure representing the humanities, actually. But it seems to me that's a really interesting, if obscure area of science diplomacy. The different countries have been, you've probably been involved too, right? Have been involved in it, and it's now at a bit of a kind of crossroads, precisely for what you say. That you had people who were astronomers who wanted to figure out how could the data that is scattered by telescopes get processed by high-performance computing, how could you work across boundaries in a square kilometre array? And essentially that's kind of really interesting case study. That some of that over the last 10 to 20 years was about how do you knit together coalitions of universities, countries, scientists, and increasingly commercial organisations. So I'd be really intrigued to know.
Well, you know much more about this area than I do. I think we can always learn from past experience. If it worked out well, we learn something that perhaps we can transfer. If it did not work out well, we get insights into what were the mechanisms why we failed. So from this point of view, if you want to learn for the future, it's always good to take one step back and to look what has happened there. But we have really entered this era of big data. And it's so enormous and so challenging how to get some kind of agreement. First of all, people who have to agree, what is it we want to do with it? How to safeguard privacy? How to make sure that the data are secure? You have, increasing security risks with data, of course. But especially, how can we also and it's a tightrope walk sometimes. Researchers are now invited or prodded, put everything up your data into an open repository. Fine, yeah. But then, for instance, in the social sciences, if you do interviews, you promise your informants this is anonymous. So you're not putting in the name of the person you spoke to. But nevertheless, it raises the question, are you breaching an agreement that at least was tacitly there? You told the person, now please tell me frankly, this is for research, and they tell you something about their intimate lives or, things they would never say in public. And then you take this interview, even without name, and you put it into a public repository. Is this ethically correct? Or how should we handle this? And so, we stumble upon problems as we go along that raise this kind of dilemma. And we have no ready-made solutions. We have to find solutions as we go along, and this is, I think, why it is important to see what has worked, how can we get agreements. And the question of research integrity also is very important. Then you could say, well, the example I just mentioned, why don't you let the person sign a form for informed consent, yeah? This sounds easy. But I can tell you, in the life sciences, you have to sign when you undergo an operation, if you have your blood sample taken, etc. You undersign these forms continuously. No one knows what it actually means, yeah? Because the understanding, people are sick, then they have to sign something. Again, they are worried about what will happen to me tomorrow, even if they are not dement. All these raise ethical issues, and we will hear much more about that, because we are moving in a fantastic world of new opportunities. So it's great, science opens a new world with wonderful opportunities, but at the same time, we're also encountering these unresolved issues that we have to start to think about.
Yeah, thank you for very insightful talk. So I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more about what you think are about the limits or sort of dangers about the notion of international science or science diplomacy, or maybe dangers are a little bit too strong, maybe the trickiness that comes with it. More specifically, I was wondering if you could tell us more about who is getting invited in these talks as experts to advise on these issues within this discourse of crisis, right? Like climate change. Because if you had a lot of scientists from the first world, for example, then you have certain ideas of how scientific policy should be determined. But if you sort of think about sort of the indigenous populations, are they sort of getting invited as some sort of experts? So I just wonder if you could speak more to it. Because then the question of this notion of humanity that sort of you sort of already throughout your talk you sort of mentioned becomes very different, right? Whose humanity is actually being saved? It's not the same as the sense of humanity that some other people. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
No, this is certainly a good and very valid question. It varies a lot. I mean, in the UN framework, you have a structure where you now have scientific advisors, a group that gets renewed every, so many years. And they are drawn from academies of science, but also you want to include business, which is very important. You want to include geographical variety, diversity. So you try to find people from the global south, from developing countries. The difficulty in practice is that you don't have an even distribution of expertise around the world, what we call the kind of formal expertise you're looking for. And so you have an inbuilt bias to the kind of experts that advise your government, that advise or work in a company, etc. And you leave out the rest of the population, especially indigenous groups. In some ways, you have tried to invite them to the table, to let them, air their grievances, but it's not the same. So it's an ongoing struggle, and especially when it comes to, places like Borneo, Papua New Guinea, where whatever you do in terms of intervention, it affects the livelihood of people on the ground the next morning, whether you give the contract to a large company and what it will do, etc. So all this is part of the picture. And so to answer, it depends very much on the advice structure, whether you have one in place or not. The advice structure looks for having a diversity of voices. But of course, if you have too much diversity, you will have more conflicts inside and you will not get the kind of agreement. For instance, for ethical AI, I think it was Google that tried to set up an advisory board. And the advisory board had so much conflict because people could not agree that they had to dissolve it again. So this can also happen. So to get the right kind of advice, then you have, of course, advisors to governments, and you have formal and informal advice to governments. But there is the realization you have to include somehow the view of those who are not around the table. And that's very, very challenging how to do it.
How do you think about the relationship between science diplomacy and its competitive environment in higher education? The business of higher education, the business of science and research. Can science diplomacy help to make it more humane, this competitive environment? Now we're competing with the funding agencies, the rankings, and this ecosystem. So, how do you see it?
Yeah, I don't see a direct place for science diplomacy in that, because universities are more or less autonomous, and if they agree to work together with other universities, or to buy curricula, or to buy people to etc., governments usually don't interfere, and diplomacy is still related to the nation state. Yeah? Remember, science entered the state, and diplomacy, it works under the radar of relations between countries. A business model, you have transnational corporations, and now you have transnational university business models. So I don't think science diplomacy is the answer for what you're looking for. It depends, in my view, both what students are looking for, jobs, they want jobs. But if, as we see in some cases already in the United States, if tuition fees get too high, then parents say, or even the students say, it's not worth it, I will be indebted for the next 10 years, and therefore I will not pay these high student fees anymore. So this is one way. If you want, the market regulates itself. If demand and supply no longer match, then that's it. The rankings, as long as as long as they work to keep a good and healthy balance between competition and cooperation, it's fine. And science is about a good balance between competition and cooperation. You need your colleagues, because they are the ones who can judge what you do. They give you the criticism that you are looking for. At the same time, you compete with them. And, I come back to the ethos of science, and if it works well, this healthy balance, it's good for science. For universities, and especially if you have a hard business model behind it, this is much more difficult. Sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but the gist of my talk was to raise issues. I'm not here to give you all the answers, but I want you to leave the room to think about some of these issues that, and so much I can say, I'm convinced you will encounter them also in the future. They will not go away. And no one has a ready-made answer for them. So it is really up to us to think about it, to discuss these issues, and eventually, answers will arise.
Thank you, Professor Holly. Your early slides attract my attention that states were anxious when science spreading, and it's like science become a new power to challenge the state. And apparently these days, it seems that states use science to expand their power and influence. I have two examples, like Newton Fund in UK. The British government, they provide millions of pounds Then they built collaboration with around 15 emerging countries, because one of the officers said they are worried about the economic status, and then they want to develop collaboration with emerging and developing economies. So, and in this way, they use this so-called science fund to build collaboration, but the motive behind sounds so political instead of pure science collaboration with the developing countries. Another example is China. China is growing so fast and so big with the Belt and Road Initiative. They are sponsoring the so-called beneficiary countries. They sponsor the citizens to study PhD in China, like Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. What do you think about this trend when science is being used to so-called expand influence by advanced countries to the emerging or less developed countries?
I fully agree with your analysis. I think, science diplomacy uses science in order to further national interests. But at the same time, and this is why I brought you the picture of this Russian-American cooperation, at the same time, not everything is captured by that. And as long as national interests are involved, it is a means to further the national. It can be market, it can be, or the geo-economic expansion strategy that China practices is a good example. It can be normative, There is no country that does not have some kind of interest. Interests are all over. There is no pure science without some kind of interests attached. But nevertheless, there is, in scientific cooperation, still the intrinsic trigger, the intrinsic motivation. You want to do good science. This is a characteristic that every good researcher has. He or she wants to advance knowledge. And then, it can be beneficial for this, it can be beneficial for that, it can do harm, or it can become something that is risky, etc. All this is part of a very complex mix. But I agree, and of course, developing countries are in the weaker position to start out with. So if they are not careful in the kind of aid that they accept, it can turn out to their disadvantage. But at the same time, also in developing countries, you have far-sighted people who can, tell the government, don't do this, do something else. That's the world we live in.
Okay, so we can still have one or two questions. Question?
No.
Okay, if not,
we have one.
So, thank you for the presentation. My question relates to the slide about the norms of the science and the last bullet you had that involved the public, involved people. Has the rise of conspiracy groups and faux science organizations like the Flat Earth Society and anti-vaxxers, has that had an impact on the science diplomacy at all, or the norms of science?
Well, on science diplomacy, I mean, vaccination is a national regulated affair. But it's very annoying when you have highly developed countries that had vaccination since the beginning, like France, that has one of the highest anti-vax movements. Or in Italy also you have. So it's annoying, but at the same time there are ways of countering it where the state comes in. In Germany now there is a new law: every child has to be vaccinated, full stop. And the parents who don't vaccinate their child, they will be fined, etc. In other countries, they try to tread a little bit more cautious and say, well, the child will not be admitted to kindergarten, the child will not be admitted there. So forcing the parents in an indirect way. But there, the state has still the power to say, the evidence for vaccination is as clear as that. But then, of course, in some countries, you have the fear, like in Pakistan, where medical teams have been attacked because you have these rumors. One of the diseases, epidemics that broke out were related to vaccination. This is a very unfortunate situation then, where it's difficult to control. So it can, situations can get out of hand. But I would say conspiracy theories and fake news are not good for everyone. They remain toxic.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.